adapting myths, stories, and fairy tales. This is a class about adaptation of stories into a new medium, a medium specifically such as screenplay, TV pilot, and we'll talk a bit about adapting into other things like novels and plays as well. So, we're in a staged channel. Make sure to raise your hand if you want to be able to speak. And if you're not watching us on Discord, you should come join our Discord community, which is called Script Camp. It's the biggest of all the Skill Camp servers, Skill Camp being a non-profit offering free and low-cost classes to help you learn new skills and achieve your life goals. We have lots of free classes, table reads, script swaps, and writers groups here on Script Camp and on our novel writing server, WordCamp. And new boot camps starting soon in all these different categories, which will take you all the way from idea to finished draft in just a very short amount of time. 6 weeks for the pilot, 8 weeks for the feature, 90 days for the novel. So here's a couple things coming up. We have week 1 of our new session of feature screenwriting. That's going to be Friday, July 21st, 6 p.m. and running 6 to 8 p.m. on Fridays for 8 weeks. Sunday, July 23rd, we have week 1 of TV pilot, 10 to noon. That will be running Sundays from 10 to noon for 6 weeks. So it's not too late to join those. Even if you missed the intro overview class, you can still come by, join week 1, try it out, and see if you like it. Decide if you want to sign up for the rest of them. We also have a new class on writing with partners with a couple special guests that will also be Sunday the 23rd at noon. A class in August on writing for younger audiences over on WordCamp. And also we will have that first session of our new 90-day novel course on WordCamp in August. Here's a breakdown of those new dates when they start. So Sundays 10 to noon is pilot. August will announce the new date for the bootcamp for novels, but that's going to be running Saturdays 12 to 2. And then features is on Fridays 6 to 8. We have unlimited memberships are now as low as $19 a month if you get the whole year option. If you're buying yearly, it's going to be $29 a month for access to over 100 hours of live events and classes, access to things like the video library with recordings of absolutely every class and event that we do, big discounts on consultations and proofreads, access to Advanced Lab, Writers Lab, every boot camp, every event, every class on every server, WordCamp, Film Camp, Toon Camp, all of these. So check out unlimited subscription, enroll now, and get started. What else? All right, so let's look at our overview. So we'll start with just what is adaptation and why are we doing this? We'll look at what actually can you adapt, what is available to be adapted, and how you might consider what you're going to pick. We will look at choosing a medium and assessing the size of your story and figuring out what your new goals might be. Because your goals might require you to change the original source material pretty drastically to fit into a new form. If we think of something like, what would Hansel and Gretel be like as a TV show? It almost takes a complete reimagination of the entire thing. So we're going to have to pick your medium carefully and decide what shape your story is and how to fit it into its new shape. Outlining source material, we'll go over just these basics. So how do you break down any story into these sort of 3-act essentials in which we can compare them to, like, you might use the same outline that you would use for a feature or for a pilot, even if it is just a short story or, I don't know, a song or a joke or something like that. We should find some way to fit it into 3-act structure just so we can see where our key beats are and we can know what specifically we have to do in order to properly adapt this narrative. Settings, we'll talk about keeping or changing the setting and what elements of the setting can or should we change. We'll talk about altering, updating, or modernizing characters and taking new and interesting points of view in stories that are adaptations of previous ones. So maybe how to bring out interesting elements of characters that were not as expanded upon in these original stories. Or how to reimagine these narratives from the point of view of another character that may have a completely different take on what's going on, might have a new way to approach the situation. What else? Playing with genre and tone. So we can talk about altering genre, altering tone, doing different takes on source material and fitting them into different sort of genre shapes and fulfilling different expectations with the stories than they originally intended. And last, we will have an exercise on fairy tales and myths where we're going to have volunteers. And you guys are going to get, we have like a little game where you'll either pick the story you want to adapt or you'll pick the modifiers for the story, and then I'll pick the source material for you. So you can pick one or the other, but you're going to be blindsided by one or the other option. So you'll be forced to sort of reimagine a story in a new context, which should be fun. Okay, so let's start with basics. Adaptation. What is adaptation? So we are taking an existing work, which we're going to refer to as the source material, which is often a book, comic, or video game. Nowadays, it's often things like a toy, a breakfast cereal, or a snack food, as we've seen. But it could be anything from a Bible story, a myth, a fairy tale, or a true story, and transforming that into a different medium such as a film, TV series, or a stage play. That's going to involve translating that original material's story, characters, and themes into a new format, potentially discovering or mining new themes, new characters, a new sort of arc of the narrative within that same story, considering the unique limitations of this new medium. So your old medium had certain limitations, your new one has certain other rules and things that it can do well, and so you have to kind of assess what the old one was doing and why, and figure out what can you do in a new and better and different way. What do we gain by choosing this new medium? Adaptations often are going to require changes to accommodate the requirements of the new medium and to enhance the story's visual, auditory, or interactive elements for your audience. A lot of people will get really bent out of shape when they see a movie of their favorite book and they're like, why didn't they just follow the story of the book? I don't get it. It's so easy. It's all right there. Well, I think you will quickly realize by attempting to do this that that is not the case. We cannot simply copy and paste scene by scene text from one medium into another and have it work as a story. Occasionally you'll see exceptions to that. I believe when directing Sin City, I believe they used the comic as like the storyboards for the movie. So now and again, you will find a way that that can work, but a lot of the time you have to make significant changes in order for it to even make sense in its new medium. Sometimes there are stories that are referred to or considered unadaptable, or this will never, unfilmable, they call it sometimes. There's no way to possibly turn this into a movie because, well, some things like certain books, certain stories are just not visual mediums. There are some that don't really tell a coherent 3-act story. If we're trying to adapt something like a nonfiction book, the question is often, where do we even start? You can figure out a way. You can figure out how you can write a story that will take the key points, the key themes, characters, setting, whatever that is from the original, and shape it into something in the new medium. Whether or not it works, that is, up for debate and analysis. But you can, at the very least, try this out, and you'll start to see how difficult it is and how much more there is to it beyond just, well, why don't they just copy and paste the text from the original? Okay, so what can you adapt? So you have a lot of things that are options for you. We have public domain is probably going to be your best source. So stories whose copyrights have expired or were never protected or never copyrighted in the first place are considered part of the public domain. And this will include classics like everything from Shakespeare plays to campfire stories, Bible stories, Grimm's fairy tales, myths, legends, everything that's no longer restricted by copyright or never was in the first place. Anything with the word folk on it, folk songs, folk tales, things like this are passed down in oral tradition, and there may be copyrighted editions or versions of them, but the original material is non-copyrighted and is completely available to you. Now, often this is going to be stories that are more than 70 years after the death of the author, in the US at least. These rules do change over time, and they may be different in a couple years, but for right now, author's death plus 70 years usually makes something fall into public domain. But for works created by anonymous authors or corporate entities, copyright duration might vary and get really complicated thanks to people like Disney or corporations like Disney that keep changing the rules around. What else? Works with available rights. So stories where the rights are simply available for adaptation, those would be available. I mean, you'll have to secure those rights, which will involve negotiating with copyright holders such as the authors or publishers or estates to obtain those necessary permissions, and this is much easier if you have an agent or manager who can reach out on your behalf and lend that sort of level of credibility to what it is that you're doing. Whereas if you just email them and say, hi, I'm a big fan of your book, can I adapt it? They're most likely going to say either no or how much are you paying, and you will have to have an answer to that. You're almost certainly not going to get the rights to something well-known and popular for free. And if something is on bestseller lists and something is well-known enough that it's a household name, there is almost zero chance that some entity has not already purchased the rights or currently is developing, holds the rights and is developing an adaptation of that property. So keep that in mind. You will not be the first to the race on something really popular. Somebody else will have already snapped that up. So your options are usually not modern popular things. Your options are older popular things, or maybe if there's a book that just is self-published and maybe hasn't gotten that much attention, but you really like it, you can contact the author and just ask if they'd be willing to let you take a swing at the adaptation. Might be possible, but the more well-known it is, the less chance and ability you will have to do this. What else? Creative Commons and open source content. So some creators like to release their works under Creative Commons licenses, allowing others to adapt or build upon them within specific terms. So certain, this is a very sort of new media thing, but somebody might release a series of stories online and say anyone can do whatever they want with these. So you have to check the open source status of that work. Collaborative or licensed projects, so that would be things like shared universes or franchise, which might have guidelines or licenses that allow for adaptations within that framework. For instance, if you like the Star Wars or Star Trek worlds, you may be able to pitch books set in that franchise to that publisher or to whomever holds the rights to that franchise. If you are an established author already, they're usually not going to approach brand new authors for this. But if you are a well-regarded and well-known, slightly successful author that has had some hits in the same genre space, you might be able to work on licensed books within that story space. So something like, Avatar or Star Wars, something that big, will have books that are set in that universe that are not always written by the original author. So that's how those are kind of adaptations, and they do sometimes exist in parallel with the canon, the original story material of that world. And last, we just have any works with authorized adaptation agreements. So just a creator or copyright holder has entered into some kind of agreement with either an entity or a specific writer to adapt their work. So they've licensed it to you, they have made a deal with you, they have signed on the paper that says you can adapt this. So a lot of these are pretty hard to get, but you are mostly going to be able to draw a lot of this from public domain works. So author's death plus 70 years. Every time somebody writes something, it's automatically sort of registered at the moment of creation with no need to actually register that copyright yourself. But if you really, really want to go out of your way to do so, you can. As soon as a work is created and fixed in tangible form, it is considered protected by copyright, though. Fair use is an important aspect of copyright law that allows limited use of copyrighted materials without permission. And maybe Nacho can speak a little bit more to this than I can, because he knows a lot more about this kind of stuff. And this is very case-by-case basis, but we're considering factors such as the purpose of the material, whether it's for educational reasons or parody. Nacho, can you talk about how in those contexts you will find actually that you get some opportunities to adapt things that you wouldn't otherwise if it's being used for specific reasons?
Yeah, definitely. So, well, fair use would not include just like taking a novel and adapting it. Like that would not be fair use, right? But you could, like fair use is the reason why we're able to make a documentary about something that is, let's say, involving copyrighted, you know, materials or stories. But how can you report on it without actually, describing it or incorporating some of what you're reporting on, right? But in general, like parody is great. I just wrote a satire recently, political satire. I think if you have, one thing, I don't know if Connor mentioned this or was going to go over this later, but like there is something to be said for maybe adapting something that maybe you don't have the rights for just as like a writing sample.
That's true.
And you wouldn't have necessarily the rights. There are some questions like where you want to have some, like a lawyer give you feedback. Like if you're satirizing or you're making a parody about Walmart and you call it, Floor Mart or something, like how there could be some, certain like tests of does this part qualify as a parody or is this like infringing on trademarks or those kinds of things, right? Where you want some legal advice, but in general, like if it's a parody, you're generally going to be all right.
Mm-hmm.
Like just like if you think it passes the sniff test, like is this really a parody or am I just trying to get around adapting like this famous novel by Stephen King by injecting something funny into it? Like that wouldn't necessarily be a parody, right?
I kind of do want to see someone try to do that, though. That would be pretty funny. Just it's almost like the Nathan for You dumb Starbucks bit where he like suggested that a coffee shop rebrand as a parody of Starbucks by just saying we sell the dumb espresso, the stupid menu item. That'd be like the version of that with a movie. That'd be funny.
I think Connor, you mentioned before maybe that you read Red Shirts. Is that right?
By John Scalzi. I know of the book. I've
Yeah.
not read it personally, though.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not that familiar with it, but I mean, I guess that would be like a great example, right? It's sort of like adapting, Star Trek, but with a parody in a way that it just, like it's okay because it's make sort of satirizing Star Trek.
Yeah, or you can just write in a similar setting with characters that are pretty clear parallels to characters from something else, and you can get away with a lot that way. Okay, so what else? Yeah, we went over fair use, copyright, and protection. So this is how you find stuff to copyright. Look for stuff that the author's been dead for 70 years. Here's a bunch of stuff that is public domain on the left and has been for a while. Everything from Tom Sawyer, Wuthering Heights, Wizard of Oz, Scarlet Letter, Midsummer Night's Dream. And then on the right, we have some things that are pretty recently public domain, as of as of a year or two ago. These, I think we're up to 1926 by now, but this is a couple of the recent things to enter public domain, which includes Great Gatsby, The Trial by Kafka, Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, Ulysses by James Joyce, Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft, The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton, Gift of the Magi by Owen Henry, Dubliners by James Joyce, and The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. So, there's new things that enter public domain every year. There's even a day that some people call Public Domain Day, where I forget which day it is. I don't think it's January 1st, but it's close to there. And it's when all the new stuff kind of becomes legally available. You can do whatever you want with them. Some things are going to be public domain sooner than we think. These are entering public domain within the next 10 to, some of these are about 20 years, but Brave New World's public domain in 2028. That's in 5 years. Brave New World will be available for anyone that wants to do an adaptation of it. A couple other notable ones: James Bond in 2034, so that's not that long. In about 10 years, anyone can make a James Bond movie. Lord of the Rings 2043, I believe, is the current estimate for that one. And then you see various other ones here. For Whom the Bell Tolls by Hemingway, also 2030, so just in 7 years or so. The rest of these are kind of far out, but they at least give you the sense that nothing stays protected forever, and eventually everything that we make will itself move into public domain as well. Everything published before 1928 by now is public domain. Thank you, Nacho. Yeah, so the list I had up a minute ago was these are as of 1925 or 26. Now it's up to 1928. So check out anything before 1928 if you want to adapt it. So how do we choose a medium, though? So novels range from 60,000 to about, 400,000 words. There's no real max on how long a novel can be, but in the publishable range, they sort of peter out around 400,000 to 500,000. And they feature at least 60 scenes, with the potential for many, many more. So, like, the shortest book will have about 60 scenes. That's novels. If you're adapting nonfiction, it could be more variable. Nonfiction doesn't need to break into scenes in the same way that a novel does. So, movies are about 80 to 120 pages long and have about 40 scenes. So you can already see, by going from book into movie, you automatically have to lose about 20 scenes. Pilots are 30 or 60 pages and consist of maybe 15 on the lower end and 25 on the hour-long end of scenes. Short stories and novellas map really well to movies because movies are basically short stories in a lot of ways. And the fact that they have a beginning, middle, and end that is intended to be consumed in just one sitting makes them very more similar to short stories than they are to novels. A novel maps better to a TV show. And they're so expansive, like full novels are so expansive most of the time, not all of them, but a lot of them, as soon as they hit about 100,000 words, then they become so expansive that a show or limited series is often a better approach for adaptation, simply because you're not going to be able to do everything the book did. And if you need to ask yourself, what are my goals? Because if one of your goals is, I want to faithfully adapt the story as closely as I can, and you should always remember, as close as you can, you're never going to get 100% fidelity between the movie and the book. There's not a lot of very, 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 very close adaptations out there. I've seen a couple. No Country for Old Men is pretty close, but there's a couple scenes that play out differently. But it helps when, the filmmakers are really devoted towards writing a faithful adaptation of that story, and they have a lot of power to do so. Not always will you have those abilities. What else? So, you have to assess your goals. Ask yourself, what primarily am I trying to get out of this? Rarely should it be you saying, I want to faithfully adapt the story exactly as it is in its original medium and replicate that into another one. A lot of the time, your goal can and maybe even should include things like, I want to bring out this element of the story, and in a movie version, I'm going to make it really exciting because in a visual medium, I'll be able to do these things that wouldn't work in the book. If you look at something like the Lord of the Rings books, the battles are not really getting a ton of screen time. And this clearly was a sticking point for Christopher Tolkien after the movies came out, and he came out and derided the movies as action movies for 25-year-old men, I believe is how he kind of phrased it in his signature way. But at the same time, looking at them, these very well-regarded, very amazing action-adventure movies, you sort of see how adding in more focus on the battles just works better in a visual medium. The fact that we can stage these things with amazing special effects and thousands of soldiers on screen at once, we do gain something from staging those battle scenes in the way that we just didn't have the ability to in the original text. And maybe the author wasn't interested in doing in the original text, it's true, and we have to weigh that against the benefit. So you're always weighing intentions of the author versus the benefits of the changes that I am making. And you have to sort of argue for those changes because there's always going to be someone unhappy with the changes that you make. So outline your goals carefully and consider these things in the different mediums. First, we have feature scripts. So when you're choosing a feature, this is a very visual medium, first of all. We can sort of condense the dialogue a lot. So in terms of going from book dialogue to movie dialogue, you'll have to make the conversations shorter and more to the point a lot of the time. And you can use cinematic techniques that we just can't use in books. Things like, intercutting. We can do transitions between scenes. We can move through the world in a different way. We can achieve effects on the page or in the film in such a way that you just couldn't do in a book. Like a long one-take scene, for instance, is very effective in a movie. It doesn't make sense in a book because there's no takes in a book, right? When the camera never cuts. You can, in a book, phase in and out of flashback mode a little bit more easily, where a lot of people go wrong in choosing the film adaptation is trying to adapt a book exactly as it is written by over-relying on flashbacks to do so. So be careful with that because it's much more jarring in a feature or show than it is in a book. The greatest weakness in feature script adaptations is that screenplays will just require substantial condensing and restructuring, so excision of certain story materials to fit within the typical feature runtime, which is 80 to 120 minutes long. The main benefit of this is that they have a definite ending. So if you are adapting something, even if it's like a fairy tale that's just like one of the many adventures of this character, you are writing a version of the story that is definitive and has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Whereas when you're writing TV, you just fundamentally don't have the ability to resolve everything. When you're adapting into TV, you're going to have to structure it to fit episodic format, meaning that you will have to imagine the first chapter of this longer narrative is this, or if you're adapting it as a sort of a status quo-based continuity format where every episode sort of resets, then you're going to have to reimagine the story or the source material as a setup and a situation that can lead to many more situations. And some books make this easy, right? If you're going to do Sherlock Holmes, it basically already is a TV show setup because we have a sort of status quo element. Watson and Holmes live together, they solve cases for money, and they're, roommates who are also mystery pals. So it's easy to adapt that into a show because it already feels like one. It's already the continuing adventures. It's already episodic, is what I mean to say. So something that is already episodic makes for great TV. And if you're doing a sort of premise-based show with a longer narrative to it, then it can make sense for you to pick TV as your medium simply because it will take many different chapters to move through all of this story material. The main drawback is that pilots don't have definite endings. And you're unlikely to see your show as anything other than a writing sample. If you just consider it, as I mentioned in pilot class earlier today, a pilot is a proposition to create a multi-million-dollar company that will employ hundreds of people for many years, and we just don't give those out very easily or quickly. So you probably won't get your show to begin with. It's going to be a sample for you, and you have to kind of find a way to be okay with that. And moreover, it's possible you won't get to the, quote, best parts of the narrative if you're only trying to adapt like the very first part of it. So you have to factor that into how you're structuring the narrative very carefully. And you have to imagine ways to work around that problem and not save all the best stuff for later. Because if you have a book where the you're just trying to adapt the first act into the pilot and saying, well, all the good stuff will happen eventually down the line, we're just not going to believe you. So you have to sell us on the cool stuff in the pilot alone without holding back all this cool stuff for later. You have to give us a great taste of what that cool stuff is going to be. And you have to treat the pilot almost like a trailer for the rest of the show. It's an advertisement for the rest of the show that's meant to hook people and get them interested and get them coming back week after week for years. It's not easy to do. So shall we move into outlining source material? So you need to write an outline for the original text using a normal beat sheet, and if it doesn't really map perfectly to that structure, you just have to kind of do the best that you can. And given that we may be adapting things from hundreds or even thousands of years ago that had no consideration for cinematic 3-act format or whatever, you may have to stretch this a little bit or imagine stuff to kind of fill in the gaps at times. So I've outlined Red Riding Hood in just kind of basic beat sheet. We start with our normal world, where I've just called her Hood here. Maybe she goes by Red or something like that, but I've called her Hood. So Hood is at home. We learn of her relationship with her mother and her responsibilities around the farm, and we come to kind of assess what her day-to-day is like. The catalyst is she's assigned to deliver a basket to her sick grandmother. So in the original fairy tale, maybe we didn't really have an intro sequence, but we started on the catalyst, so we had to kind of add this in and backfill this and imagine, okay, before she goes on the journey, we want some sense of what her life is like, because if things are going to radically change, we need to know what they are changing from, right? So we have added this intro sequence where we're like, this is what Red Riding Hood is like, this is what's missing in her life, this is what she wants. Then we say that she is assigned to deliver the basket of, is it medicine or food, to her sick grandmother. So we enter into the trying the locks sequence, where she's warned to stay on the path and to avoid strangers. She heads out on the journey but isn't quite sure at first. It's spooky in the woods. She contemplates whether or not she should follow the instructions, or maybe it's okay to take a shortcut to get to the grandmother's house a little bit faster. And she wonders what she's going to do until she decides that the break into two, she's going to take the shortcut, entering the territory of the wolf and sort of leaving the path and entering the upside down world of the second act. This is basically a horror story. So, premise scenes. So she encounters various friendly woodland creatures which provide lighthearted moments and showcase her innocence and trust, and sometimes in some versions they even warn her not to go any further, and she's like, stupid rabbit, I'll do what I want. Along the way, we see the wolf. He stalks her, and maybe this would be a good place to have an internal monologue from the wolf as he follows her or something like that. Maybe he has a wolf cub with him that he can sort of tell his plan to. He's like, we're going to stalk her, we're going to follow her and wait for a chance to strike. And then he rushes ahead to the grandmother's house and eats the grandmother first, and he gets in bed waiting for Riding Hood to show up. So the midpoint is she arrives at the house, unaware the wolf has beaten her there and is now posing as the grandmother. We move into escalation. So the stakes are raised, right? At midpoint, it raises the stakes. So now, instead of just meeting her grandmother, the wolf is in disguise. The grandmother is dead, or is in the wolf's stomach, not dead, depending on the version. In escalation, the wolf tells her, come closer, give me the basket. And, oh, what great big ears you have, Grandma. We have that whole sequence. And then we hit all is lost when she realizes the wolf's true identity, all the better to eat you with. We move into the pit of despair, where she's being chased around the cottage by the wolf. She faces the consequences of her decision. Why did she stray from the path? And she's recognizing her role in this upcoming danger. She's realizing all the things she did wrong. She fled from the wolf, tries to escape, but he hunts her down and eats her. A huntsman arrives looking for the grandmother, and it seems like he's going to be the next victim. Oh, it just seems like everything's over. Our break into three is Hood inside the wolf's stomach has to summon her sort of inner strength and resourcefulness and realize everything she did wrong. I never should have walked off the path. I always should have, I should have relied on the people I trust, not on people I can't trust. And she outsmarts the wolf and decides to escape his clutches by alerting the nice huntsman to her presence in the wolf's stomach. She and the grandma make a bunch of noise. The huntsman is alerted. He cuts the wolf open and rescues them both from within. Okay, I know there's a bunch of other versions to this and different ways that this can go, but I sort of had to stitch this together just into a coherent, more or less 3-act version of the story. All right, so you're going to have to start here by doing this. If you're not using this structure that I use and that I sort of including in all my classes and materials, you'll have to have your own structure, which you may have some great other thing that works better for whatever it is you're adapting. But in my re-outline, I stick to my beat sheets that I use for everything that I'm going to use for the final product too. And of course, if we were to map out the actual pages that these take place on, reimagining Red Riding Hood, I guess, as a short film here for the first part, it's going to be something like the intro is about a page. She enters the woods on page 2. We're trying the locks up until the break into 2 at the bottom of page 2, probably. Premise scenes are going to be like 3 to 5, midpoint on page 5. Escalation 6 to 7, All is Lost on 7, Pit of Despair on page 8 to middle of 9. Middle of 9 is going to be the break into 3, and all the way to 10 we do finale. Something like that. So we can just map this to about a 10-page short for the first place, which is a nice place to start, just a nice even number like 10. So you can start with that and make sure that you are including all the major things that you'll want to include in your version. Nacho asks, does it help to outline or make a list of the scenes in the source? I don't really know. It might, depending on how expansive your source material is. I usually don't make a list of scenes or think that there's much point in numbering scenes before you actually move to scene cards, though. So depends on you. It might be helpful for you. I wouldn't do it personally. Thank you for the question. What else? So once we have done your re-outline, you're going to have to assess what do I want to keep and what do I want to change. And a great place to start is just on the setting. So we have to ask, where and when does the story, the original, take place? First, we have to look at time period. So the era, period in history when the story occurs, whether it's past, present, or future. And the thing about a lot of myths and fairy tales and folk stories like this is that they don't really take place during a specific time exactly. It's not like in Red Riding Hood where like we start out by saying, medieval Germany, 1250 AD. We don't need that because this is a story that could take place at any time. And of course, we can imagine that in its original context was probably in like a medieval or pre-medieval setting, but doesn't need to be. And it could actually, you could just do a straightforward adaptation of a fairy tale a lot of the time that just takes place in modern day. But you should assess if there is a time period attached to the original work of this, and if there isn't one, you might just sort of assume that it's when the story was written, unless there's something to indicate otherwise. So next we look at geographic location, the physical place or places where the story is set, and this can range from specific cities and countries to fictional or fantastical worlds, or maybe there just isn't really a very defined geographical location in the original story, in which case you're going to have to define one probably more carefully in yours. We have environmental details, so that would be natural surroundings and physical environment, including landscapes, weather, geographical, all the features, the land that we're in, the climate, the biome that we're inside, the conditions, and anything else that just kind of affects how the characters live in this space. We have social and cultural context, so that's going to be social norms and customs and cultural aspects that shape the characters' lives and their interactions within the story. Some stories really rely on their original social and cultural context. For instance, any story where some girl gets married off to some guy she doesn't want to marry, but she gets forced to go and live in his castle with him or whatever. Well, that wouldn't really happen. That wouldn't exactly happen in modern day America. We don't really marry people off anymore. But you can see how maybe we might be able to re-envision that in a modern context by changing some of the specific motivations that lead to that happening. Or you might start to think how I can move that to a different time period, or make it make sense in a different cultural context. Sometimes you'll find some interesting new way that it can fit into a completely different culture that the original author may never have thought of or intended at all. We have a question in the chat. What about multiple myths, like a Worlds Collide situation? Sure, there's nothing stopping you from combining multiple mythological stories together. I think Shrek was a kind of a successful example of this, where it's just sort of like all fairy tales are real and exist in the same world together. Nothing wrong with that. Or maybe you want to create a sort of TV show that, like a shared universe of, let's say, Norse mythology. Maybe you want to have a bunch of interconnected stories about every character from, your Thor to your Loki to your various gods and goddesses of that pantheon. You can do that too. Nothing wrong with mashing multiple stories together. What else? So we have to look at historical and political background also. So we talked about time period, but political context might impact the characters and plot, providing this broader context for the narrative. So you have to look at what was the context of the original story, and also what am I moving it to, and how does that create challenges, changes, or differences. Some stories are very tied to their political context. We even had a couple Orwell books on here, like Animal Farm in 1984, which are both going to be public domain in 2044, but regardless of that, they are extremely political. And other books too, like To Kill a Mockingbird, also very, very, very political. So same with Fahrenheit 451. Same with a lot of these things. And you have to imagine that moving it into a new context might sort of require you to address the same themes, but in a modern way. Or you might ask yourself, how can I find new themes that are sort of brought into the spotlight by the passage of time and technology and culture and politics and all these things? And what is the story now sort of commenting on in a way that maybe the original author may never have meant to, but now I can see that in a new context, the story means something totally else. I think Shape of Water is a good example of this sort of starting as Creature from the Black Lagoon, but then we are going to not exactly do an adaptation of it, but sort of modernize a lot of the ideas in that story and sort of make that kind of love, that forbidden love between person and monster, as like the central theme by which we explore everything else in that tale. Paul says, I hate politics. I miss non-political books like Animal Farm. Paul doing a clear satire joke here. Yeah, a lot of old books that are public domain that are up for adaptation, extremely political, and that's fine. A lot of things in life are simply political. What else? So yeah, make sure to work through your re-outline, getting all the important stuff in place, and then you want to maybe think of the setting and what are you going to change in the setting and why. You really never need to justify way too much why you're bringing something into a modern context, because you can always just sort of say, well, I felt that the themes and major elements of this story worked well in a modern context, and this brings it to a bigger viewership or readership that wouldn't have experienced it or found it relevant otherwise. You can pretty much always say that, so no one's ever going to drag you over the coals too much for adapting and updating and modernizing a story. We'll always kind of get the need for that and see how in a modern, since the modern context is always changing, there's always going to be a bit of demand for newer versions of older things. Here are some things to consider in your adaptation, though. One is understanding the source material. So you should, this might sound dumb, but you'd be surprised. You should read the source material through and through, like all of it, if you can. If there's so much that there's no way you can possibly read all of it, like you're writing a story from a series of really dense religious texts, you probably should still try to read it all, or if you want to deliver the best possible version of this, you need to read as comprehensively in the world, arena, or author as you can. Which isn't to say that you have to read every fairy tale ever written if you're going to write a fairy tale, but you need to read a lot of them. You need to read a lot of different versions of the one that you're reading or of the one that you're adapting. And do your best to analyze its themes, characters, and underlying messages, both in their original context and maybe even messages that you can draw from it that were not intended or may not have been brought out fully. And you can try to grasp the core essence that makes it a compelling story, and always ask yourself, what do fans of the original, what would they really want to keep? What do they still really want to see? We have this question of fan service. Maybe you guys have heard this term, fan service. Does anybody want to kind of define what is fan service for us? Lee, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
I hear you. Go ahead.
Awesome. So fan service, as I understand it, is there are things that you can do where you're sort of changing the source material and it makes it better for the story or better for the new medium. But then there are also things that you can do where you change the source material in such a way that you're basically just catering to, I think that there is a niche of people that are really into this, that are going to like this change. And usually it's called fan service when it actually negatively affects the story, or it doesn't actually make sense to what you've already set up with the characters. It doesn't add any conflict. And so I think that's usually when the claim is made, is when it kind of has a negative impact overall.
Yeah, this has a negative connotation to it. But at the end of the day, people love fan service. Like, there's a reason why it's there. And it's like, for instance, let's imagine like the iconic line that your character always says in everything, right? Like the big fan service moment is when your character says this line in an awesome way in your story, right? And so it doesn't have to be bad. There is the negative. Mostly people do bring it up, and I guess they don't always identify it as fan service if they're just like, oh no, of course that should be there, right? So
I think that's a distinction, but I don't think we have a word for when it's used really effectively. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah. Good point. So I think fan service gets a bad rap, and it can be used in annoying ways. And I mean, to me, a Han Solo movie, when they're like, oh, what? So you're getting on this plane by yourself? What are you, just solo or something? He's like, maybe that'll be my new name, was just like the dumbest fan service ever. But you sort of see why it's there. I mean, because the fans want to know, why is he called Solo? or we might imagine that they do. I personally didn't care that much, but you see what it is at least. And then again, there's some contexts where it's worked really, really, really great. And I find that the best way to sort of approach this is you should have something for the fans is like important to have, unless the whole point of your adaptation is I'm throwing away everything about the original and reimagining all of it. I'm throwing it all out and totally making a completely new version of this that flies in the face of the original and is intended to sort of tear the original to shreds. Maybe there's a way that can work, especially if you're sort of adapting something that you are satirizing in the first place, or maybe you're adapting a book that you felt had a harmful message to begin with, but you're reimagining it in a new way, and that has, positive message connotations instead of the negative ones. But you can always you can almost always find this way to include what the fans are waiting for in a way that you really build up to it and sort of tease them with it, and then when it finally hits, it just is way more awesome. I'm thinking of Judge Dredd 2012 by Alex Garland, the Dredd movie. What does Dredd always say? I am the law. That's like his catchphrase, right? He's usually bellowing it at a group of criminals. And how do they find a way to this line in the movie? Well, Dredd is talking. He's trapped, and he's at he is in a building full of bad guys. He's on a PA system. He's talking to every bad guy in the entire building, and instead of yelling this line, he says it in like a very kind of quiet, intense, serious way that makes it awesome again in a new way. Where he's, instead of yelling "I am the law," he's like, he gives them a full speech, and at the end of this, he says like, your employer, mama, is not the law. I am the law. And like the way that it comes out feels natural and also feels earned, and it doesn't feel cheap or tacky. It kind of feels like exactly the thing he would say in that moment. So I think by building up to the fan service moment properly, you have to like re-earn it. You have to find a different way to earn it than it's normally earned, if that makes sense. And that's how you can find those moments. And they can be like stand up and cheer moments if you do them well. You're right, though, that a lot of the time if somebody identifies something as fan service, they'll be like, oh, of course you had to do that, because the fans would have been so annoyed if you didn't say the cool line. Okay, any other questions or comments on fan service, Lee?
I don't think so. I really love the positive take on it, because I think it's really important to talk about that side of it, and like paying attention to what matters to fans of an existing piece of material. Yeah, that's really cool. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, we have to respect the fans. The fans are why we're doing it. We're writing it for the audience, so we are trying to make the audience happy. That's kind of the whole idea. Identifying relevance is another adaptation consideration. So you want to determine which aspects of the original work are going to resonate with audiences today and explore how they can be amplified or emphasized to maybe tilt them towards contemporary issues, concerns, or cultural contexts. I mean, this might involve examining these more timeless themes or universal human experiences or their sort of relevant social, political, or technological elements and asking, how can we find a new purpose for these things? Or how can we bring new elements out of these things? And a lot of great stories are timeless, but also have these elements that can be expanded upon in a way that makes their current relevance clear. For instance, I mean, what if we did a Little Red Riding Hood story, but it was following a little girl in an immigrant family trying to cross the border into America, right? That would be a totally different take, and we could sort of, maybe the wolf in that one is kind of a coyote, right? Or like a sketchy smuggler drug runner who tempts her off the path. And now suddenly we have a new version of Red Riding Hood that maybe we could still have fantasy elements, or maybe you could reinterpret that to be an entirely realistic thriller, right? My first script that I broke in with was called Peter and the Wolves, and it was about a boy in World War II Leningrad who, when his friend gets kidnapped and eaten by a cannibal, not a monster cannibal, but just a person that has eaten him, he assembles a group of other kids to hunt them down and kill them. So that one is not exactly a direct adaptation of Peter and the Wolf, but I sort of wanted to take the fairy tale, the symphonic fairy tale, and by reimagining it or by placing it in the context of a really realistic, gritty, and brutal war-type scenario, I wanted to do that to bring out the sort of innocence of the protagonists and like the fact that it's children who are doing this really dark and morbid, really violent, brutal task, and they live in this violent and brutal world, and sort of narrating that with an element of whimsy kind of draws these two things into contrast and makes you feel that clash of innocence and pain and violence more. So to me, it amplified both things. It amplified it added a new sort of layer to the original Peter and the Wolf narration, where now we're sort of seeing it in a creepy context, and we can sort of imagine how these moments of narration might sort of apply to a similarly themed story in a more realistic way. And it also just overall, I think it added to that contrast between children like it worked because it's children protagonists, I think. And the fact that we had children in this horrible scenario kind of made it make perfect sense to me to narrate that with something that preserved their sense of curiosity and whimsy, and allowed us to zero in on this idea of music as a rejuvenating, like a sort of source of life and light. What else? So we have talked about understanding the source material, which you should definitely do, and identifying the relevance of it. So you need to know why you're making changes. So let's talk modernization. So updating the setting. We might want to consider how the story setting could be adapted to a new context. A lot of the time this will be moving things forward in time, but it has kind of drawn my interest to think, what would a reverse chronological adaptation be? Like, imagine let's adapt a James Bond book, but set in the medieval era. That would be kind of cool, right? So instead of an MI6 spy, he's like a spy for the crown, I guess, for the king. That could be really cool to see some reverse chronological adaptations. Someone should do that. I think that's very cool. We don't see much of it, of course. And the reason is, I mean, people generally, the majority of people will prefer to see something that is set in a time and place that they recognize and are familiar with, which is modern day. So that's not everybody who will, and there's some stories that just only work or fit into certain contexts, but a lot of the time, the general public prefers to see things set in worlds and times that they are familiar with. We have to ask questions like, what is the time period, geographical location, or cultural backdrop, and how can we change that to reflect current realities? I mentioned, instead of the girl getting lost in the woods, maybe she's getting lost in the U.S.-Mexico border, being tempted away from her family by a smuggler or something like that. So we can sort of try to maintain the integrity of the story's essence. It's still about a little girl being warned not to trust strangers or stray from the path, but we can ensure that this updated setting enhances the themes and resonates with the intended audience in a new context or a way that it just simply hasn't before. Next, character development. You should evaluate the characters and their traits and motivations and relationships. Modernization involves reimagining characters to align with contemporary sensibilities and diverse perspectives, and this is often going to involve giving traditionally marginalized characters more agency in these stories, updating gender roles, or simply addressing stereotypes. I mean, even in things like some Shakespeare plays, we see some portrayals of characters that we would probably not portray in that way nowadays because they are insulting or reductive or offensive, and we just don't need to have that. You don't need to maintain the things that are offensive or insulting about your original source material. Especially if it's, well, let me put it this way. If it's a public domain story, you don't owe the author anything. So if it is a story that you have secured the rights to, you do owe the author something for sure. And you should be more careful to maybe figure out, why am I changing this author's specific works, and what about it am I altering? But more than that, if this is something that came out a long time ago and no one currently owns the rights to, it doesn't matter what you change. You can change whatever you want. And even if someone, are there some super fans of your fairy tale that are going to come out against you and be upset that you've changed Little Red Riding Hood to, I don't know, a middle-aged man or something? Maybe. But that's why you have to do this carefully and with thought behind it and with a reason behind it. But there's no reason to maintain insulting elements of your story. You're not going to earn bonus points from your audience if they're like, wow, I was insulted by that as a woman or as a minority or as whatever. And I was pretty insulted by that, but at least it was true to the source material. Like, you're really not going to earn that many points from that. So be careful there. What I'm doing now is I'm working on an adaptation of some old sword and sorcery stories from about 100 years ago. And a lot of there are, first of all, almost no female characters, and the ones that do exist just sort of fall at the feet of the hero and pledge themselves to him right away, which is just kind of like, feels gross and weird nowadays, so we don't have to keep that. We can change that. We don't want someone to walk away from this feeling like they've been talked down to or insulted or provoked. We have a question, is this being recorded for the vid library? This is recorded on our all our social media, so you can watch this back on YouTube. Thanks for the question, Paul. Language. So adjusting dialogue to reflect modern speech patterns, it doesn't mean that, you basically have a choice, and a lot of the time the best option is sort of in the middle of these things. but you can either have your characters you can either make an effort as the author to have your characters speak and act exactly as they did in this time, or you can update it slightly to make it more understandable. And I guess on the other end of the spectrum, we have like the Shrek version, right, where they speak in just exact modern parlance, maybe because it's just funnier that way, or maybe because we imagine we're sort of translating what's happening with your characters in their current context into the modern one. So you're ensuring that dialogue sounds authentic and relatable to contemporary audiences in that version. Or you can just try to go the historian route and do something like David Eggers does in his movies like The Witch or The Lighthouse, and you really, really do go hard in attempting to recreate the original speaking styles. It's important to try to strike a balance there for the most part. I mean, Eggers is like the extreme end of the spectrum, and then the other end would be like the Shrek, so the Eggers to Shrek continuum, we can call it. So that the adaptation, we should just make sure it doesn't lose the flavor or style of the original work, unless diminishing the flavor and style of the original work is really key to your goals in the first place. What else? POV. So you might consider, in your adaptation, you don't have to follow the point of view of the same protagonist as the story gave us before. And sometimes it can bring brilliant new things out of it to keep the characters the same, but otherwise we are following a different person, so we see a sort of a closer glimpse into what is motivating them and causing them to be involved in the story, and like build sympathy for them in a different way. We can consider a villain perspective to retell the story from the POV of the antagonist, exploring their motivations and backstory and the events that led up to their actions. And maybe we can do so in there are some versions where something like Wicked, or like the Star Kid parody called Twisted, where we are imagining that the original story was told to us wrong. Like, the original story we've heard is a, quote, twisted version of that original, and this is the truth. We're going to tell you what really happened. That's kind of a fun way to take the villain's POV and maybe even reimagine the hero as somebody genuinely sinister from the villains, from where they are, from their angle. So we might be able to provide insights into the perspective of the antagonist or a protagonist and sort of humanize them more, offering a more complex and nuanced understanding of that character. Side characters are another great choice for adaptation POV. We might shift the focus to a side story and tell that story from their point of view. Whether that means putting them in the sort of same situations as the hero was previously in, that would sort of be like, we're going to do a movie about Little Red Riding Hood's cousin, but she's the one that wanders off the path. Or it could just be, we're going to do a story about Little Red Riding Hood's cousin back at home on the farm while Red Riding Hood is out on her adventure. You can do any way you want, but this allows for the exploration of this other character's personal journey, motivations, experiences that might parallel or intersect with or maybe overwrite the main storyline in some cases, and it can really just add depth or a fresh take on the familiar narrative. Last, we have maybe gender, race, age, ability differences. You might consider altering the characters or some elements of the protagonist or key characters in the story to challenge whatever role they are in to begin with, and challenge the expectations to provide new insights into the dynamics and themes of the original story, or maybe to bring some new theme out of the original story. It can also open opportunities for exploring social, cultural, and personal experiences from these different perspectives. So you might imagine, what if we do Little Red Riding Hood, but we swap so she's male or non-binary, or we change the race of a character, or change the age of a character, or maybe we say a character is differently abled than they are in the original story. There are some considerations, of course, and really, really key things to look at here and consider as you do this. Let's look at the pros and cons of changing character, race, gender, etc. in any story. So, first of all, representation and diversity. So just swapping the race of a character or gender or age or anything else allows for greater representation and inclusivity that might offer opportunities for groups to see themselves in prominent roles that have just not seen that before. It can promote diversity and challenge traditional stereotypes and norms and, create cultural conversations within this new context. Relevance and resonance, updating characters to reflect a more diverse and contemporary world just might make the story more watchable to modern audiences, more relevant or relatable, and you're not going to be able to exactly address every social issue, but you can try your best to sort of foster some sense of empathy and spark conversations about maybe equality and inclusion or things like this. You might also zero in on some element of the original story that you feel wasn't expanded on enough in the previous work. So I've seen, for instance, a version of, there's a play called Wojciech, which is about a male soldier, but I saw a play adaptation of it where the director cast a woman as that soldier because she sort of interpreted this character as an inherently trans character, or something about this character's perspective that just suited the trans experience. And so cast a woman in that role just to sort of see how we can bring these new themes out in a different way. What else? Fresh perspective. So changing the race or gender or any age, anything else of a character can provide a new look at or interpretation of that story. It allows for the exploration of different experiences, cultural dynamics, and identity themes, which might enrich the narrative and offer fresh insights. And last, just creative freedom. I mean, just because we change a few elements of a key character, it sort of opens up the possibilities in the mind of the audience. If we say, like, these key things are different, well, I'm kind of a little more okay with other main things being different if you've sort of changed some of the fundamentals. So it's possible that you can bring new layers and complexities to this adaptation, adding depth and intrigue with these changes. There's also some cautions. The first is fidelity to the source material. I mean, swapping any traits of the characters might deviate from the intentions of the original, which could lead to concerns about just faithfulness of the adaptation. And if that was in your set of goals to begin with, then that might be a problem for you. Or if you're hired by somebody to adapt something and they want you to stick to the material, that might be a problem. Some audiences might have strong attachments to the original characters and might be resistant to significant changes, which can lead to backlash and controversy, which I think we've seen all the time, because all this, I'll say it, all this stupid, boring culture war stuff that revolves around, you can't change my blank and blank, and they're like, well, we did change your blank, and, well, I mean, at the end of the day, we're all trying to watch and create stories that we enjoy, that enrich our lives, and that make us, entertained and think about the world in new ways and things like this. But there is a significant portion of audience that really kind of thrive on outrage nowadays. Outrage has become a sort of addictive form of social media engagement for a lot of people. So by even changing anything about the original, you're going to annoy some people. And they're going to say, why didn't you just copy and paste the text from the book? And they don't understand that you can't always do that. Or that those themes and stories may just not work well in new context. So it's important to handle adaptations with sensitivity and care. I mean, not all backlash is bad. Sometimes you'll get backlash and you deserve it. If you get something wrong, like for instance, if your attempt is poorly done, you might run the risk of tokenism or shallow representation, which is an additional challenge that you're taking upon yourself by going down this route. Superficial changes alone may fail to address the underlying systemic issues or contribute to genuine inclusivity in some kind of way. So just changing something just because you feel like it and without having good intention and thought and rationale behind it might end up hurting you more than it does help you. Because fans of the original won't like it because it's different, and new fans may not like it because it's clearly not done well. So you have to just be careful and do this well. Last, we have just the impacts on story dynamics. So by altering the race or gender of characters, it might just change how the story goes or would go. It requires consideration to ensure the changes enhance the narrative and don't undermine the original intentions or themes of the work. For instance, I could see how if you do an adaptation where you change the gender of a main character from male to female and the character is a soldier, it's going to be a completely different experience because in a lot of armies, women aren't serving in frontline roles. So it's going to be like, how is she serving here? How is this allowed? If you're doing a World War II story and swap from a male to female character, you may really have to invent some other elements that make it make more sense. So there's both challenges and there's both social considerations, and you do have to factor in your readership and who's reading this, and are they going to be annoyed that I have altered elements of the story that they were attached to. Okay, I am going to step away for just 1 sec to put something away, but I'll be back in a moment, and we will take any questions on what we've talked about so far. So, changing setting, or characters, or point of view. I'd like to see any questions or comments on that topic. I'll be back in just a moment. All right, I'm back. Looks like we have a hand raised. Go ahead, Coda.
Oh, wait. Haha, there we go. Mute. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we hear you now. Go right ahead.
Awesome. First of all, fantastic conversation so far. Love this. This is great. I have a question in regards to setting more than anything. So, when we're looking to adapt, say, I'll just throw an example, like Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, which is a short story. And we're trying to, it's already in America, basically. So the setting, you can, modernize it in terms of like physically, like, oh, it's set now. But in terms of geographic location and things like that, like, I think the question is, what kinds of decisions could you make to kind of adapt it well, without changing too much? Because Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde can essentially be set really anywhere. But Irving was very much set in, no, sorry, whoever wrote it, I forget the author's name at this point. But he was very much set in, New England and in that particular period. So the question I have is, when we're looking to adapt something, specifically when it comes to when it's set in a very specific place already, and how do we kind of, how can we kind of change it to still basically fit the story in a way that's not going to be too cumbersome to kind of overcome? Because I think it would be difficult to adapt something such as Dr. Jekyll if we put it in something that's completely ridiculous, like, for example, the moon, just to be something very outlandish, just for argument's sake or whatever. So I don't know if that's an answerable question or not, but it might slightly be rhetorical. But it's just something that I'm thinking about, like, how do we kind of conquer the question of setting in a reasonable way, to where we're making the correct decision on that.
Sure. This is a good question. So I would ask, so you're wondering, how can we determine what should we change the setting to? So I would look at the original setting, and then you said it was London, or wait, where was it set to begin with?
I think it was like Boston or something, somewhere in like New England somewhere.
Okay. For some reason, I thought that was set in London, but maybe just because that's usually lumped in with a bunch of other sort of Victorian horror type stories. In any case, so yeah, I would ask yourself, what are the traits of the original setting? One, Boston. Okay, so we have, maybe it's sort of more of an industrial type town, right? And this was this was written like shortly after Industrial Revolution. So we might imagine that a lot of the sort of genre fun we might get from this, a lot of the spooky scenes might be kind of wrapped in that smoke and the fog and the smog of the factories and stuff like this, right? So I would just kind of write down a couple traits like that. One, the city's smoggy. Two, we're in an area of industrialization. Three, we have, I don't know, dark alleys with long spiky shadows, and maybe just sort of physically describe the place a little bit. And then ask yourself, what is a city in a modern context that has all of those things? And we might answer the question, maybe you want to set it in Detroit. That's a very industrial city. It's not exactly going through the same sort of industrial revolution right now. Maybe you'd want to set it in Detroit in the 50s. That could be kind of cool. Or maybe we could set it in, like, what's another big sort of industrial city in America? Maybe you want to set it in modern New York, in the sort of, like, one of the kind of, like, factory districts or something like that. So I would write down a combination of things. One, the themes that the story is exploring because of the setting, given, the historical period and all these things. So it's a period of blank. Okay, industrialization. Great. So we want to pick a setting that also has that, even if it's not in the same kind of way. And then look at things like the aesthetics and ask yourself, what kind of city in a modern context would allow me to explore those same aesthetics, but possibly in a different context, right? Like, maybe you want to set Jekyll and Hyde in a city like, I don't know, Mumbai, India, which I'm sure has gone through its own sort of industrial revolution at a certain point. We're trading out the sort of long, spiky shadows and Gothic architecture for, maybe you want to swap it to kind of like a sunnier setting. Maybe we're going to do a tropical beach setting, but with that same sense of looming oppressive industry and fog and mystery to it. So yeah, I'd write down like 5 traits of your setting, context, aesthetics and appearances, and things like this, and then write down a couple options for other places, other settings and locations that fit the same bill, but nowadays. Hope that helps and answers that question okay. It looks like Lee has a question. Go ahead, Lee.
Hi. I am wondering if you can talk a little bit about making these choices through a lens of theme. So I feel like whenever I'm thinking about adapting something, I tend to zero in first on what I think the theme of the story is, or at least which of the themes is kind of calling my attention. And then I'm trying to choose these things like time period and like geographic location by like, does it matter that it's set in this place versus another in order to serve this theme, or could I change something without drastically like making it a different story? And I wonder if you have thoughts on that.
Sure. So theme, so theme is an interesting place to start as well. Most of the time, I don't begin with theme as the very first thing, but this is something I kind of find along the way. But maybe you do want to start with it, and that can work as well. So I think that a lot of the time, when you're adapting a story, you want to keep the same theme. And in at least at least like 50-60% of the times, you are trying to communicate that theme in a different context or in a different way, right? So now that we live today, take that same theme and apply it to modern day society and ask, how can I communicate that message now? So if we have this question of don't talk to strangers and stray from the path is the sort of theme of Red Riding Hood, right? So maybe you might think in your story, you're setting it in modern day. What does it kind of look like today? Well, a lot of the time predators use technology and the internet to sort of lure children and to harm, kidnap children, whatever, right? Maybe at the start of the story, she, instead of being tempted by a secondary path, she gets a call on her phone. And the call on her phone, it ends up being from the wolf, right? And the wolf tells her, oh, hey, I'm lost in the woods. Can you come help me? And in this way, we sort of have the same theme of the story. It plays out the same way. Maybe she calls the huntsman from the woodsman's stomach with her cell phone or something like that. This is kind of silly. But you can see how you can build up to the same theme, don't talk to strangers or don't stray from the path, using modern stuff or modern things that only make sense in a modern context. And thus, that's how we kind of update these stories and make them feel relevant a lot of the time. Does that make sense, Lee, how you might kind of look at the same theme and ask, what does it mean now? And then use that to determine how you will change what happens in the story itself.
Awesome, yeah.
So that's not always how you have to do it. And sometimes you don't want to write the same theme. Maybe you want to write Little Red Riding Hood, but you say, I'm actually going to do the opposite theme. The theme is sometimes strangers are the only ones that can help you. But again, if you are changing the setting or time period, you need to ask, to modern day, if you're modernizing, you need to ask, well, what does it mean now? Why is that true now? And the answer might be, well, because in a world where parents are so much more distant from their kids and they have so much more autonomy, sometimes strangers are the only ones that can help you. You can build a case for anything, which is the cool thing about storytelling and dramatic arguments, is that you can start with any theme and then make a story that proves that that theme is sort of true in that context. So you don't have to pick the same theme that the story had, but usually the reason that we do pick that same theme is because the story did a good job at conveying it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Hope that answers that question okay. I'll keep taking text questions if you guys have them. But let's go on. Let me just check the chat really quick, make sure there's nothing I wanted to get to. We have a question from Cinnamon. I'm intrigued by what I was saying about taking modern stories and setting them in the past. But what kind of modern stories do we have that aren't copyrighted that we can use for that? Well, not a lot. Like 1928 or whatever is kind of the cutoff. Things before then are usually going to be public domain, but like there's no reason, for instance, that you as a screenwriter with an agent or manager couldn't take a modern book and then pitch an adaptation of it set in a different setting, time period, or something like that instead. I don't think there's very many examples of this, though. It was more a theory.
Okay, it looks like maybe Connor has just a temporary issue with the Wi-Fi. Hopefully, will be joining us in a moment. Any other questions on anything we've gone over so far? Or especially questions about like copyright related stuff that may be easier for me to answer.
Is that working now?
Okay, we heard. Yes, we can
Oh,
hear
okay,
you now.
good. Sorry about that. I didn't lose connection. I think I just had to re-plug in the mic. What else do we have? Did you ask for questions? All right. Paul says, I would think about how the setting change causes you to engage differently with whatever story or creature, etc. you happen to be adapting. Yep, setting changes often require you to engage completely differently with the story or characters. How much modification does something need to not get copyrighted? What? How do you interpret this question, Nacho? What do you think he's asking here?
Okay, so.
Oh, I think he's saying, so how much does something have to be
That
altered before it's no longer violating copyright?
Well, that's a great question of Cinnamon's. Or, well, I guess it's Bitterben's asking a question. How much modification does something need to not get? Okay. So, yeah, it's kind of something maybe I, like could have gone into more when we were talking about fair use. So, fair use is kind of like, let's say, you could be writing about what if you could include in this sort of like if you're writing an adaptation of like a real person's life, right? And you can write about a character, about a real person. That's not, their life isn't copyrighted. Facts are not copyrighted, right? So you can write a story, but are you basing it on a nonfiction book that you read, a biography of that person? How much is what specifically just in that book that you read versus like what are facts that are just widely known, like, reported in newspapers and there are multiple sources. So that's maybe kind of what you're talking about. The other thing is, I guess, if you're talking about, let's say you got inspired by a modern novel and you want to write a movie that's similar, how can you adapt it or how can you write something inspired by that would not be considered infringing, right? And that's a kind of a tricky question for like a lawyer to maybe review your draft or something and really, but basically ideas cannot be copyrighted. So an idea of a story, a plot, a lot of those kinds of things are not really going to be like copyright protected. You can give the same person, two different writers the same exact idea and they're going to write completely different scripts. I guess how much are you changing? There is some kind of threshold where this is not changing it enough, and this is like, okay, this is changing it so much that there's no way that this would be considered infringing. And then there's probably like some sort of gray area in between where you could get in trouble or maybe not. And you probably want to talk to a lawyer. But I don't know. Hopefully that answers your question. I don't know if that specific.
It does sometimes come down to things like percentages of words that are the same and stuff like that. So like there is a complicated field of copyright law that goes into working out disputes like this. Most of the time when someone sues for infringement that's saying somebody copied my story, they do not win. And that is because a lot of the time they will just identify kind of superficial plot elements as something that they relate too much to their own story, and it will just they'll feel like it's just like theirs. But in reality, it doesn't actually play out like theirs. A lot of the big lawsuits fizzle out in this manner. We have a comment that, so like Hamilton, for instance, bought the rights to a specific biography of Hamilton, and there's a couple reasons that studios will do this, even if they aren't really planning to adapt that text as written. They want to have a source to draw, like one definitive source to draw their facts from. So I'm thinking, for instance, in this case, The Social Network was based on a licensed adaptation of the book The Accidental Billionaires. But the way that the movie played out was entirely Sorkin's own invention, and the way that people were characterized in it were not really like they are in real life. It's more an impressionistic version of how he kind of interpreted them to be. And the reason they'll do this is the first is just to have that sort of one thing that everyone can look at, and we all say we're drawing our inspiration and facts from this source material. And the second is to kind of stake a claim in that IP space so that everyone knows that they're sort of saying, hey, everyone, look, we're doing a Facebook movie. Nobody else should do a Facebook movie because we are claiming it by optioning or licensing this book.
It also helps a little bit, like the person working at the studio who's like sort of, internally championing this project, just to be able to say like, hey, this is based on some kind of, something that we license. There's this book sold X copies, so there's some kind of finance department, reasoning for adapting it, and also it's sort of like, I guess when you have this kind of like project that's already, it's kind of based on something else. It just makes it a little bit easier to kind of internally
to justify the studio making it, because it will just like check certain boxes and they're looking for stuff that has a built-in audience, and it feels like something that has a successful book behind it just automatically has a big advantage in terms of this will build confidence easier from investors.
Nobody else can get that book.
Right, exactly. Now, if there's multiple books written on the same topic, then it's a free-for-all. But if there's multiple books written on something, chances are that there will be... It's such a well-known topic that there might just be multiple movies about it. The weird thing, there's this recent... this woman who leaked... she was like a whistleblower or leaker in the U.S. government. I forget. Somebody should clarify exactly what she did, but her name is Reality Winner. Do you know about this?
Yes.
And
yeah.
There's 2 adaptations of her story coming out. One of them's called Reality. The other one's called Winner. Weird, right? So that can happen sometimes, and sometimes studios will fight over adaptations, and they'll all race to get theirs out first or whatever. But this is sort of all out of our hands. As writers, all we can sort of do is write the best thing we can, or maybe if you find some definitive biography of a public figure or something, if you use that as the basis of your adaptation and you can get the rights to doing that, then chances are you'll have a little bit of a leg up in getting that movie or show made. Okay, so playing with genre and tone. So it's possible that you might combine or blend multiple different genres that weren't part of the original text into some sort of unique adaptation, which can inject new energy into the story and attract more diverse audiences, or sort of show us, even if it's very well worn and familiar, the fact that you're taking a completely different genre approach to it might make it feel fresh and new again. You should just ensure that that fusion is coherent and serves the story rather than being entirely a gimmick. Tone shift and emotional resonance. So you can experiment with shift in tone to evoke different emotions in the adaptation that may originally have been intended there. I mean, to turn Red Riding Hood from essentially a horror story into, I don't know, a romance would require quite a few changes and create different emotions than the original one did. Maybe you have some incredible new way the story can convey its original intended tone. Maybe if you look at something like, I really actually liked the recent adaptation called Gretel and Hansel, which is a horror movie based on Hansel and Gretel. The fact that we've swapped around the names sort of tells us there's something different here, though, right? Which is cool. I like how it's just a clue, a cryptic indication that something is different about this one. We really focus on Gretel as the main character, sort of having her own witchy aptitude and getting like tutored by the witch and becoming a witch herself in that one, which is all very cool. And it is the original tone. It's a scary horror story about kids in the forest who run into a witch. But I guess the fact that we have focused on this Gretel character and her transformation and coming of age allows us to approach this from a different perspective, and also just it has really amazing, creepy, cool visuals that we wouldn't have been able to do in an adaptation when the story originally came out, which obviously was in, like the 1500s, and they did not have movies. Looks like we have a question from Cinnamon. I've invited her to the stage. She'll need to click accept. You may need to turn if you're on the phone, you may need to turn the device on its side to find the accept button. I'm going to keep going with the slides, but if you are able to join the stage, feel free to speak out and ask your question. So let's move on to our exercise portion. And Cinnamon, if you want to type your question instead, then also feel free to do that. So I want to start with either, so we're going to get some volunteers, and you're either going to start by picking a story, or you're going to pick some modifiers. And these are modifiers like swap the genre, change the time period, swap the gender roles, change the setting, something like this. So when we call on you, you're either going to be able to pick one or the other, and I'll choose the other thing for you. And then the idea is you're just going to fill out like a quick little checklist, and then we're going to have like 5-10 minutes, maybe 10 minutes to work on your new version. Just fill these out. It doesn't have to be in so much detail. Just this is to help you imagine a new version of this tale and a new way to think of it. And then we're going to listen to you pitch your new version of the story. It doesn't have to be perfect. You're not being graded. This is just to come up with ideas and to practice putting into execution the things that we have talked about today. So let's see some hand raised for volunteers. Thank you for volunteering. Let's get Cinnamon's question while we have people raising their hands for volunteers. Cinnamon, can you hear us okay? I'm seeing you go back and forth from muted and unmuted. Still not hearing sound. Maybe on push to talk mode. Okay, it seems she's left the stage, but feel free to rejoin later. We'd be glad to hear your question. Okay, so it looks like we got 3 volunteers, which is perfect. So I'm going to bring all you guys up. Hello, volunteers.
Hi.
Hey.
Hello.
So let's just go straight down the list, and we'll ask each of you if you want to choose your story or you want to choose the modifiers. Let's start with Dakota.
I will. I'll choose the story.
Okay. Go ahead.
I'll do Beauty and the Beast.
Beauty and the Beast. Got it. Okay. Let's give him some modifiers. So I'm going to give you. Let's do different time period and swap the generals.
Can you repeat the second one?
No.
Sorry, say that again. Go ahead.
I said, can you repeat the second one? Was it swap the gender roles?
That's right, yes. So swapping gender roles and changing
Got it.
the
Okay.
time period. Right.
Got it.
All right. Lee, what do you want to do? Story or modifiers?
Story. I'll choose Jack and the Beanstalk.
Jack and the Beanstalk. Okay. I'm going to give you
Fuck, I was gonna...
let's go with change the genre. So entirely new genre of story. It's no longer a fantasy adventure. And let's introduce a big twist. Maybe unexpected midpoint or alternate ending, something like that. But you're going to surprise us and you're going to throw a wrench in the gears and change things up.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
And can you hear this? Oh.
Hi, Simon. We can hear you now.
Hi. Oh, good. Okay. Should I ask my question now or just wait?
Let me choose.
Go for it.
Well, let me choose one more. And so, sorry, I'm only seeing m ... as your username for some reason. Discord is doing this thing where it cuts off usernames. Can you tell us your name, third volunteer?
It is monster_03.
Monster03. Okay. Which one would you like to choose? Modifiers or a story?
I'll go with Robin Hood.
Robin Hood. Okay. I'm going to tell you alter the point of view. And you're also going to... let's change the genre.
Okay.
So no longer...
And we're allowed to do other things as well, including those?
You can change other stuff too. That's just going to be, I guess, the biggest changes. Or
okay.
A good place to start. All right. So while you guys are hard at work on that, I'm going to... let me just give you like a little checklist if you want to fill this out. You don't really need to do this, but if you want to have something to just be typing on, you're going to have 10-15 minutes to fill these out. I'll move you back to the audience for now, and then when we call you back up, you're going to pitch your new versions of these stories. Okay, I'm going to take Cinnamon's question in the meantime.
Hello. Yeah, so my question was, like, you talked about adapting maybe like modern stories or things that might be copyrighted, biographies, etc. So like as newer screenwriters with obviously no clout, like how would you recommend that we approach that? I feel like it's kind of unrealistic to say, oh, I'm going to get the rights to James Bond and adapt it medieval. But then like what about smaller things? Like if you find something, I don't know, by an indie author you want to adapt, or I don't know, like how would you like write to that writer first and see if they were okay with it? Would you just write something and assume that if it went somewhere you'd figure out the copyright things later? Like how would you handle that?
On here as well, but what I will say is that it's always okay to write a writing sample. If you can write whatever you want, and if you're not trying to sell it and you're not trying to get it made and all these things like this, then no one's gonna get on your case. We've seen some examples of people get a lot of sort of spec success on things like, I'm going to write a Seinfeld episode set on 9/11, or like crazy things like that, right? Which are meant to grab attention and intentionally use something copyrighted just to sort of make a splash. You can totally do that. I would usually think of these as what are called stunt specs, where you're never going to get it made and you don't want it to. You're just trying to get eyes on it and get attention. So if you do that, if you're like, I'm going to do a movie where I'm going to write a script where Shrek joins the Air Force, or something like that, and it's really, really funny and really good, then you can use that as a sample. That's fine. In terms of approaching the authors and getting those rights, Nacho, what do you have to share on that one?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I mean, if you look at the blacklist from the past several years, I mean, there are tons of like Harry Potter scripts or whatever, Madonna scripts that are never going to get made, right? Like it's okay to do that just as a sort of like a writing sample. And then if you're interested in optioning the rights to adapt something, it's, like you will need to usually pay some money unless you can, like this is a friend of a family or something like that. And just all these, there are a lot of authors of fantastic books who've been hoping to sell their novel to Hollywood and get rich for, decades and haven't sold it, right? And so I mean, there's something to be said for like, if you're optioning a book that's kind of obscure, like, does it really help your package as like, hey, I want to develop this into a film? Like now you've got to go. You basically you are the producer now, so you're becoming a producer. You're like, if with money you can, you can option whatever. I mean, it doesn't matter who you are. Like there are authors who are looking for, maybe there are other authors that have like Stephen King has a program for sort of like indie filmmakers to just option something for $1 and like develop it. And, there's a whole like process to apply for those kinds of things. But in general, like, expect to pay a certain percentage of, there's like a purchase price, how much would have to be paid to like actually get the rights when the film goes into production. And there's like an option fee, which is maybe, some percentage of that purchase price. Maybe could talk about that. Like we had another class that was like a lot more in detail and that kind of stuff. But yeah, it is possible to do that. Just keep in mind now you're becoming a producer, right? And that's, something you can do. It does cost money and nothing may ever come of it. So it's better to use someone else's money if you can.
Okay, cool, thanks. And I was also sort of wondering along with that, Connor, if you can think of like, I don't know, types of stories we might have that are modern, because you were talking about setting modern like Cinderella. I mean, like obviously they didn't have copyright back then, but they had these stories that were sort of known in their culture that weren't copyrighted. But I sort of feel like it's still in some ways it's like old stories still that are most known. I don't know. Do we have like modern stories that are passed around that aren't real but that we all know?
You're asking about sort of modern versions of folk stories. Yeah, I think a lot of the time, if you look at things like creepy pastas online, things like Slender Man are kind of like the modern version of that. And like urban legends and folklore will always be around in one form or another. So I would look at like sort of internet fiction, SCPs and stuff like that are sort of a version of that kind of cumulative style of like storytelling that anyone can contribute to. The back rooms are another kind of thing, like phenomenon like that it's like, oh, everyone can kind of write stories set in this world or using this general same idea. That's all kind of in the horror-ish world. That's because that's my main genre that I pay the most attention to, and I'm sure there are examples in other genres too. But when you're looking for stuff to adapt, it doesn't just have to be old things from public domain. There is modern stuff that is sort of in the public domain too. It won't always help you though to, like Nacho mentioned, like just because something is an adaptation won't always be a huge benefit. It might just be that you sort of you're like, oh, I want to do a spy movie, like I want to do Mission Impossible set in the year 1555. That would be cool, but at a certain point, you could just like say this is just an original story, right? Like no one's really gonna get on your case about a medieval spy being too similar to Mission Impossible, unless you have like identical characters or plot structure or something like that. I may have kind of forgotten the original question. Did we answer the question?
I think you did answer the question. Thank you very much.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Simon. Okay, so it looks like we have a few other folks have wanted to participate in the activities, so we'll add a little extra time, and we will. Looks like we have somebody has chosen Noah's Ark and somebody has chosen Riding Hood, so I'm going to give you guys modifiers for that if you want. Let's say, did I already give it to him? Okay, so I'll say Joya. Let's change the point of view. Yeah, change the point of view so it's not Red Riding Hood anymore. And also shift the setting. And then for the other one, we had Noah's Ark. Let's say change the time period. And your second modifier will be change the gender roles. All right, so we have a few folks doing these now, and they're going to come up with new versions of these stories, and they can use the little checklist that was in the chat if they really want to. Here's just a little sheet that I had of different genres if you wanted some visual inspiration for how you were going to change these things. What do we have? Sci-fi, romance, action, thriller, mystery, comedy. So we'll give you guys, let's give you 13 minutes to do this whole thing. It takes people a little time to figure this out sometimes, and you don't have to have the entire story worked out. You can just pitch emphasize what you're changing and how your version is different. And really go crazy. Do something fun. Do something unusual. It's entirely up to you. We will rejoin at the 10-minute mark before the end of class. So we're going to come back at the 50-minute mark in 12 minutes. And when we do, we'll have 10 minutes to share. So we're going to have to go pretty quickly. Every person's going to get about 2-3 minutes to tell us about your new version of the story, your adaptation. All right, I'll leave a little note up for the people watching on the stream. Recording. We will be back in 12 minutes to share. All right, we'll feel free to you can feel free to work at your own pace. We will return at that time, and if you're ready at that point, then we'll just ask you guys to go one at a time. All right, thanks a lot. We'll see you guys soon, and stay tuned to hear about these cool new adaptations that our students are working on. back with our new pitch versions of these new versions of our stories that you guys will be able to tell us about. So raise a hand if you have an adaptation you want to tell us about. I think we had Lee. Thank you. Was Terry doing one? Dakota. Hey guys. All right. Who would like to start?
I can start. This was really fun.
Sure. Go ahead, Lee.
Awesome. All right, so I had Jack and the Beanstalk, and my challenges were to pick a new genre and add a big twist. So I set this in small town Ohio. The cultural backdrop is it's a red state. It's in the 1990s, so the manufacturing industry is dying, and there's basically fuck all to do. I am from Ohio. And our protagonist is an imaginative teenage boy. So essentially, I'll read the crappy log line I wrote. A month before his high school graduation, a pensive teenage boy learns that his short story will be published in a prestigious fantasy magazine. Now he must convince his family to support this career in the arts rather than the military career they had always planned for him. The new genre that I chose for it was basically just a drama with fantasy elements that are sort of a aesthetic device that are sort of in his imagination. A comp for which would be probably like Pan's Labyrinth.
Cool. Okay. So coming of age is the new genre then, it sounds like, right?
Yes,
cool.
Totally. And then the twist that I had planned was that in contrast to the original story where the parents are kind of...
Smoke again.
So in contrast to the... Awesome. So in the original story, the family, whatever family tended to appear in Jack's life were just kind of passive or, maybe kind of grumpy or pessimistic, but not antagonistic. And so then the twist that I chose was that one of his family members has been actively essentially intercepting his mail, and they know that he's been submitting things to journals, and they have actually taken them so that they don't get sent because they don't like the idea that he would try to follow this path. And so he finally got one through, and that was one that actually got accepted, where he thinks that he's just been ignored by these journals. And it turns out that one of his family has actually been kind of sabotaging his attempts to get published.
Okay.
And then, of course, after I came up with this plot, I was like, oh, I created Dead Poet Society. So
nothing wrong with that. So let me just ask.
Yeah.
So let's just ask about some of the rules in the story. So in this version, is his application sort of like the beanstalk, so to speak, or who's the giant in this version? I guess let me just ask that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't get to the point of thinking about who's the giant or what is the giant. I think maybe the publication world, depending on how what kind of scope this story would take or how far flung it would be, probably he would get some FaceTime with people or groups in the publishing industry and have some, kind of it's not all beautiful and gold and, experiences there. But I think it would be, ultimately that this is, at the end of it, it's worth kind of him pursuing this, but he has some challenges even when he feels like he's doing what he's supposed to be doing.
Okay, so yeah, it seems like you've kind of you've defantasized the story so much that I think it may not quite be an adaptation of Jack and the Beanstalk. It sounds a little bit more like this is a coming of age story that uses the Jack and the Beanstalk kind of narrative as a thematic comment on what's going on. Would you say that's about right?
That sounds about right. And I also can definitely see places to insert the fantasy back in and bring it back closer to the original, some of the mechanics of the original plot. And this seems really fun to continue playing with.
Sure, yeah. There's no actual requirement that you write it doesn't have to be a straight adaptation. You don't have to do the same story, and you've done something very creative with it. I didn't expect anyone to try this, so great job. Thank you for the unique approach.
Awesome, thank you.
Thanks, Lee. who would like to go next and tell us about your new version of the fairy tale?
I can.
I can go.
That's okay.
I heard
Go ahead.
Dakota a little bit before, so we'll go with Dakota first. Go for it.
Okay, so I did Beating the Beast, and my two things to consider were gender swap and time period. So I set it in upstate New York, the Mohawk region, which is the native tribe that originally was in upstate New York in colonial America. And basically, it's the really terrible brief logline that I have is a vain Mohawk woman turns into a monstrous spider who cannot be killed because it hides the heart underground by the local shaman. And the only way for her to break the spell is for her to find love in the colonial settler whom she has taken prisoner. This is actually inspired a little bit by something that happened in my family. I have some, there are some records of like really long time ago, obviously, of, someone in my family falling in love with a Native American woman and everything. So that's kind of where this idea also came from as well. And I also did a little bit of research as to what kind of thing to use. It actually is a creature that this particular tribe has, and it's based off of the Hiawatha story as well. So it's kind of that kind of it's fun.
That's cool. I also like how you've sort of swapped from the normal way that the story goes is where she's a girl in a small town who ends up having to live with the rich guy in his giant castle, right? Whereas in this version, you're taking the guy from the big city who has to go out into the wilderness to be the captive of the Spider Woman, or whatever you're calling it. Right?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
That's pretty cool. I like that a lot. So in your version, is he beauty still, or how are you defining those two characters?
So I'm thinking it as he is this. It's not so much of the appearance. It's the what kind of person he is. It's a character thing. It's he's a good person. He's a person of noble standing. He's a person that does the right thing. But he's not particularly well regarded. He's just kind of average. He's just kind of this guy. Very low. Standard, but he still does the right thing. He's very peasantly. Very homely a lot of the time. He's just he would be considered like a servant almost, or like an indentured servant or something like that. But he's kind of, playing that beauty role in that sense of just being kind.
And may have to sort of, if we start with a character that is chosen for their inner beauty, maybe the story becomes about him finding the outer beauty too. So normally it's the other way around. We start with a character that that is beautiful on the outside and needs to become beautiful on the inside, but the opposite is interesting too. If maybe he's kind of reviled by his normal town, or just no one thinks much of him, but then after he enters this sort of seductive romance with this Spider Woman in the woods, maybe he finds a way to be like he figures out what beauty means.
Yeah, and it's also just trying to he could have like a savior complex where it's like, I have to save this person because he realizes that this is a person that needs help, and so he sees that, and so it's kind of not necessarily the typical like romance in terms of like I love this person, but actually love like the person beyond the circumstance, and actually look for something beyond that, because the soul of the thing.
That's very cool. Thank you so much for your unique take on Beauty and the Beast.
Oh, thank you. It was fun.
We have a few more. Who'd like to go next? We're towards the end of our time, so we'll go pretty quickly, but feel free to pitch your version.
I can go.
Let's start with go ahead, Bugs Bunny.
Oh, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so
I took Noah's Ark, so I try to use the cheat sheet that you handle us. So I have the setting. It's in August, winter. The location is the United States, Missouri. Cultural background is Iraqi immigrants in the United States. The period is the 2023 modern age. So the main characters are Nani, Noah's wife, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, and the antagonist is Noah. So an Iraqi family is this logline, sorry. An Iraqi family is living the aftermath of being persecuted after migrating to the United States. They will have to survive in this new environment and the strange behavior of the father. So the quick description of the plot would be after running away from some persecutors, the Iraqi family migrates to the United States, where they will have a hard time understanding the culture, adapting to it, and dealing with the strange behavior of Noah, the father of the family, who has abandoned all parental roles and has focused solely on the building of a mysterious project. Soon they will realize that this mysterious project will lead to the whole family being kidnapped into a boat. Now, the mother will have to find a way to free everyone and protect their kids from her now lunatic husband.
Oh,
So the genre is psychological horror, drama, and yeah.
So
there you go.
You've turned Noah into the villain of the story.
Yeah.
That's cool.
That's a plot twist.
Yeah, that's a big twist. So your husband is building a crazy giant wooden object. He won't let anyone see it, and one day he's like, you have to get on this thing along with a bunch of animals, and now we have to escape from Noah.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Now they have to find a way to leave before winter comes, so they all will freeze to death.
Right. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. Psychological horror, Noah's Ark. That's pretty cool. We got a few more. Who would like to go next?
I'll go.
Go for it.
So I had Robin Hood, and I was I almost knocked something over. I had to switch the perspective and change the genre. Now, I'm not entirely sure what the original genre of Robin Hood is, given, there are a lot of different versions, if you will, of Robin Hood, given that it's full on like folklore. That being said, one thing I noticed as like a running theme was like sort of like the despotic character of the Sheriff of Nottingham. And I thought it'd be interesting to take it as like a fly on the wall perspective. So like character, like not necessarily like character, the perspective isn't from necessarily characters who are like part of the main action, like the analogs I would have for like Little John or Will Scarlet or Maid Marian, but like some like ordinary people and I wanted to set it in a city, move it to America, modern day, and set it in a city and basically turn the entire story into a comment on like police brutality and race relations, for example.
Okay, so you're turning it from an adventure story into a crime drama.
Yes.
Very cool.
That being said, like given the quite frankly rebellious nature of like the Merry Men and whatnot, I think it would be good as well as political commentary, as just as much as Robin Hood was political commentary in the 1200s of like the king having too much power and therefore they signed the Magna Carta. Maybe it's the police have too much power now.
Right. The Sheriff of Nottingham becomes the locally elected sheriff or whatever.
Like because the NYPD or something.
NYPD, right. And maybe even, I mean, your characters, what we have to ask, like, what does taking from the rich and giving to the poor look like nowadays? maybe it involves hacking. Maybe the merry men have hackers on their side, and they're trying to sort of steal and distribute wealth.
Something that has occurred in many forms across American history has been like organized crime being sort of a protection scheme for neighborhoods and parts of cities and countries where where the police tend not to go. Like, this is particularly salient in the Northeast where immigration was heaviest. You have the Chinese tongs all over Chinatowns in the United States. You have the mafia. And in a modern sense, now you have gangs in what we would call inner cities. So I would imagine something sort of like that, because at the end of the day, it's the same idea, just like no longer running around in green pantyhose.
Yeah. Kind of what this illustrates to me is that the biggest difference between adventure and crime genres is how many rules there are and how easy it is to escape into the wilderness. Like, the fact that you can't escape into the wilderness exactly in a modern city, and you have to blend in and sort of like find a way to function in that society, means that you have to approach the same objectives, but in a different way. You can't just rely on, I can ride off and escape after this.
At the same time, you can sort of disappear into a large enough city.
Right. Yeah, in a different way.
It's its own anonymous jungle.
For sure. Thank you so much for sharing this modern day urban Robin Hood kind of idea. Sounds very cool. Should we wrap up? Terry, do you have one for us?
Yeah, I do. So the story I chose to adapt is Ricky Tikki Tavi. I'll start with the log line. A rattlesnake couple on the verge of splitting must traverse across the Sonoran, Arizona desert to stop an outlandish politician and his pet badger from executing their children at a proposed rattlesnake roundup.
Whoa.
And
okay. Go ahead.
Essentially, I did a role reversal of the central conflict. Your protagonists are pair of rattlesnake parents, and your antagonist is a politician running for governor of Arizona, and he has a pet badger or wolverine that is just named Ricky. I felt like with this particular story, I always felt like it had very problematic morals and themes behind it. So I wanted to tackle those particular issues in terms of and kind of focus more on the family unit aspect of the from the rattlesnake's point of view and their perspective, and kind of show that their survival is meaningful. And even though they're kind of snakes never get the best representation in media, the other goal was to tackle it to kind of paint more of an empathetic light towards these type of animals as well. So that would be a lot of the major changes to the themes. Primarily the biggest change or the most notable would be switching the protagonist role from the vermin to the rattlesnake or to the serpent.
Yeah, for sure. That's kind of finding a new, interesting point of view that the audience may not have considered before. It's tough to do, but it's tough to, like, our sympathies will always default to the prey, right? To the person, the underdog. And that's just human nature. We just look for the underdog and try to root for them. But the lion can easily become the underdog when you show that the lion is hunting so that it can feed its cubs, right? So you're going to run into that challenge of expressing, okay, how can we build sympathy for this predator that most people don't have a high opinion of? But it's a good goal to have. I mean, if you can build sympathy for a cobra, then you can build sympathy for anyone.
And I think that's the ironic part about mentioning that too, is that the mongoose has always been the predator to the cobra. So I feel like the badger wolverine is kind of in the same boat.
Right. For sure.
But I do know, sympathetic wise, it is a challenge, but it's one that I feel fairly adamant on. Painting these particular animals in a pretty positive light.
That's a great cause. Thank you so much for sharing this unique take.
Thank you.
We had one more text entry, which I'll just read out before we wrap up for today. Michelle had a new Noah's Ark for us set in 2028 New Orleans. Voodoo priestess named Nina has a vision from the goddess Aida, who tells her that there's going to be a flood worse than Harvey. She has to rescue people from this and animals in the zoo and has to build a big boat, have them all ride up the Mississippi to save them from destruction. She builds the boat and people think she's crazy. The flood comes, but she's unable to save all but a few animals as they ride up the river, and finally they land many miles away. She builds an altar to the goddess, and a rainbow appears. Wow, she really went through all the way to the end. Thank you for that. That's cool. Yeah, I would love to see a near future version of this that uses maybe even some of the global warming type themes that to inform like why this is happening and to tie it into modern day society more. The voodoo elements are a cool and unexpected twist too. Thank you so much for sharing this, Michelle. Joya, do you have something you'd like to share with us? Are you able to speak? Your mic is muted.
Hello?
Oh,
Can you
there
hear
you are.
me?
Hi, Joya. We hear you now.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So I would like to share on my Riding Hood story. So see. Yeah. So what happens is Little Red Riding Hood, she's got her red hooded cape that she wears. She walks into the woods to deliver foods to her sickly grandmother. She's brought wine and wheat brownies. And in this version, her mom had ordered her to stay strictly on the path. A stalking wolf wants to eat the girl and the food in the basket. He asks her where she's going. She reluctantly tells him. He suggests that she pick flowers as a present for her grandma, which she does. She doesn't trust him, so she puts on a mask and gloves. She's always carrying these moving through the forest, especially since the pandemic. And so she picks some hemlock. In the meantime, he goes to the grandmother's house, gains entry by pretending to be Riding Hood. He wanted to swallow the grandmother whole, but she convinces him that Riding Hood is on her way with wine and wheat brownies. Plus, she's younger and not as tough to eat as she would be. So, finally convinced, he locks her in the closet and waits for the girl disguised as the grandmother. So, Gma has her cell phone hidden in her bra. And upon being locked in the closet, she texts the mom to tell her to keep Riding Hood at home. Ma says she's already left. So she calls Riding Hood with no answer, but she wasn't calling to get her to talk, just to alert her. So she texts her to be aware and not to come. Riding Hood misses the call and the text. When she arrives, she noticed that Grandma's house looks very strangely quiet. When Gma's sick, she's really loud and vocal about it. And she's got a host of people around usually. She's Italian. So a woodcutter and a hunter come by with an axe, let her know that there's a wolf on, lets her know that there's a wolf on the loose. And Little Red Riding Hood says she suspected that and that G-Mom may be in danger. And that's when she notices the messages and the missed call. So they hatch a plan. And Riding Hood is like, if I'm not out within 25 minutes, come in and be a wolf axe murderer. So Riding Hood, she's already got her hemlock, so she's ready to go. So she enters, and the disguised wolf is in bed, feigning sickness. Riding Hood's like, Gma, I brought you flowers. And she's like, oh my goodness, what a deep voice you have. And she said, the better to greet you. Oh, what big eyes you have, the better to see you. Oh, what big hands, the better to embrace you. Mouth to eat. At that point, Riding Hood convinces the wolf, okay, look, let's have one last rendezvous before you eat me. Let's chill out with these wheat brownies, drink some wine, before you dig into my own flesh. So the wolf is convinced, agrees, and while the wolf is high and slightly tipsy from the wine, the hemlock kicks in. So by that time, this 25 minutes has passed, and the hunter woodcutter busts in and chops away at the wolf. And then they rescue Gma from the closet. So, yeah. Yeah, it was actually supposed to be coming from her point of view. Yeah, and I guess trying to do that, uh, I put in all that other stuff to kind of see where she was with the whole story. So, but yeah, it was supposed to be from her point of view. Yeah, yeah. Well, she's in the closet the whole time. Yeah, she has a sense of what's going on. Um, and I guess the only thing she doesn't, right. So yeah. Yeah, yeah, I guess so. So yeah. Yeah, yeah. Thank goodness that she put the hemlocks. Yeah. Right. Yes. Yeah. Would cut up. Absolutely.